The Bugatti Veyron story does not start with an engine, it starts with an ego. The year was 1999. Volkswagen chairman Ferdinand Piëch walks into a board meeting, and instead of discussing sensible things like selling more Golfs, he slaps a single piece of paper on the table. It was not a proposal, it was a commandment. He declared that Volkswagen, through its newly acquired Bugatti brand, would build a production car with 1,000 horsepower and a top speed of over 250 miles per hour. Now, to understand how insane this was, you need some context. In 1999, the fastest production car in the world was the McLaren F1. It had 627 horsepower and topped out at 240 miles per hour. It was considered a mechanical miracle. Piëch was basically looking at Mount Everest and saying, "Cool, but let's build one that's twice as tall and make it out of solid gold." This was not an engineering goal. This was an automotive hate crime against common sense. The entire industry read the press release and collectively thought, okay, the guy has finally lost it. So the engineers at Volkswagen, who are actually sane people, sat down to do the math. The initial business plan was optimistic. They figured they could sell the car for around $1 million. Sounds like a lot, right? It is not, because the immediate engineering reality was that each car would cost millions more than that just to develop and build. Let that sink in. The plan, from day one, was to lose a staggering amount of money on every single car they sold. So how do you justify that? You invent a concept called the halo car. The idea was that the Bugatti Veyron would be so spectacular, so awe-inspiring, that it would make people think differently about the entire Volkswagen group. You would see a Bugatti Veyron on a poster and think, wow, Volkswagen makes incredible machines. Then you would go out and buy a Volkswagen Golf, because nothing says sensible hatchback like a 2,000 horsepower, $1 million hypercar. It is like using a nuclear bomb to advertise a new brand of matches. The first red flag, the one that should have sent accountants running for the hills, was that nobody ever did a traditional cost-benefit analysis. They just started spending. Piëch wanted his 1,000 horsepower car, and the question was not, can we afford this? The question was, how quickly can we make it happen? They were about to open a financial black hole, and they were arguing about what color to paint the event horizon. They were so focused on the engineering impossibility that they completely ignored the financial suicide. The math did not just not math, it actively revolted. So with the accountants successfully ignored, the engineers were handed a blank check and a suicide note. Their mission? Somehow make Piëch's fantasy a reality. And what they came up with was nothing short of engineering Armageddon. First, the engine. A quad turbocharged W16. That sounds cool until you realize what it actually is. It is essentially two VR8 engines, which are narrow-angle V8s, joined on a common crankshaft. It is the automotive equivalent of trying to solve a problem by just using two of everything. The result was an engine so wide and so complex it looked less like a power plant and more like an industrial plumbing project that had gotten wildly out of hand. And because turbochargers create immense heat, they had to cool this monstrosity. This brings us to the cooling system. The Veyron did not have a radiator, it had a radiator system. We are talking 10 radiators. 10. 3 for the engine coolant, 2 for the intercoolers, 1 for the engine oil, 1 for the transmission oil, 1 for the differential oil, and 2 for the air conditioning. This car had enough cooling capacity to air condition a small office building. The front grille is not a styling feature, it is a declaration of surrender to the laws of thermodynamics. Then there were the tires. Michelin had to invent a whole new type of tire from scratch. At 250 miles per hour, a standard tire would literally disintegrate. The centrifugal force would tear it apart. So Michelin developed a tire with a carbon fiber belt, and each tire was tested to withstand speeds of over 270 miles per hour for extended periods. A single set cost more than a brand new Honda Civic. And they would only last about 15 minutes at top speed. That is a tire cost of roughly $15,000 per hour of fun. It makes burning $100 bills for warmth seem like a sensible financial plan. But the piece de resistance, the absolute pinnacle of over-engineering, was the braking system. How do you stop 2 tons of metal moving at a quarter of the speed of sound? You do not just use big brakes, you use air brakes. At the push of a button, a hydraulic actuator raises the rear spoiler to a 55-degree angle, creating enough drag to slow the car with the force of about 3/4 of a G. It is basically deploying a parachute on a hypercar. They had to invent a system normally reserved for fighter jets and drag racers just to make the car street legal. The entire project was a series of solutions to problems they had created for themselves, each one more expensive and ridiculous than the last. This was not just building a car, it was conducting a symphony of financial and mechanical insanity. So you have got this engineering nightmare on your hands. You'd think the budget would be the one thing they'd keep a tight leash on. You'd be wrong. The original development budget for the Veyron was around $500 million. That's a huge number, but for a project this ambitious, maybe justifiable. That was the lie they told themselves to sleep at night. The final cost ballooned to over $1.5 billion. They didn't just blow the budget, they strapped it to a rocket and fired it into the sun. So where did all that money go? It went into custom everything. This wasn't a car built with off-the-shelf parts. Every single bolt, every piece of software, every component was a bespoke one-off creation. They had to invent new manufacturing techniques just to make parts that didn't exist. The door handles probably cost more to develop than the entire powertrain of a normal supercar. There was a moment deep into the project when the accountants finally got a clear look at the numbers. They realized they weren't building a car company, they were building the world's most elaborate and expensive money incinerator, and it just happened to have wheels. The projected loss per car was so astronomical that it defied all conventional business logic. They had created a product where the more units they sold, the more money the entire Volkswagen group would lose. It was a reverse business model. Most companies try to achieve economies of scale. Bugatti achieved dice economies of apocalypse. Now, you might be wondering why they had to build 300 of these financial disasters. The answer is one of the most beautifully absurd parts of this story: homologation. Bugatti wanted to go racing. To qualify for certain race series, you have to prove your car is a production vehicle by building a certain number of road-legal versions for the public. The number for the top-tier classes is often around 300. The entire production run of the Veyron was essentially a very, very expensive entry fee for a race they were not even sure they wanted to enter. This led to the hilarious spectacle of road testing a $2 million prototype. Imagine the engineers tasked with making sure this hand-built, hyper-complex machine could survive potholes and speed bumps. They would take a car that cost more than a suburban mansion and drive it down a cobblestone street, listening for a rattle that could indicate a $500,000 engineering flaw. It was performance art funded by a multinational corporation. The factory where they built these things was less of a manufacturing plant and more of a glorified, money-losing art studio. It was in a former chateau in Molsheim, France, because of course it was. They were not assembling cars, they were curating financial losses with a certain je ne sais quoi. Each car took a small team of technicians weeks to build by hand. The entire operation was designed for exclusivity, not efficiency, because efficiency was a concept that had left the building around the time the budget hit $1 billion. They were building a legend, and the cost was just a minor, inconvenient detail. So who actually buys a car that is a financial disaster on wheels? The target audience for the Veyron was a very specific type of person collectors of the absurd. We are talking about billionaires for whom $1 million is a rounding error, oil sheiks who see it as a fancy golf cart, and tech bros who just needed the ultimate flex. These are not car enthusiasts in the traditional sense. They are collectors of the absurd. They were not buying a mode of transport. They were buying a conversation piece that could also vaporize its own tires in 15 minutes. And Bugatti, understanding their clientele perfectly, leaned into the insanity with the options list. The base car was only about $1,200,000, but the optional extras could easily double that. You wanted a specific color that was not on the chart, that will be $300,000. You wanted a leather interior made from the skin of unborn calves that were serenaded by classical musicians? They would probably do it. There was an optional touring package that included custom luggage, because nothing says Grand Tour like a car with a 12-mile range at top speed. The options were a masterclass in separating the stupidly wealthy from their money. Then you have the running costs, which are a punchline in themselves. A set of those specially developed Michelin tires cost around $25,000. But that is just the start. A routine service, which is required every 12,500 miles, costs around $20,000. They have to remove the entire engine from the car. An oil change alone is a multi-thousand-dollar affair. If you need a new windshield, that is $68,000. You could buy a Porsche Boxster just to crash it for fun and still have money left over compared to replacing a Bugatti windshield. Owning a Veyron is not a hobby. It is a financial hemorrhage. And my personal favorite detail, the speed key. The Veyron came with 2 keys. One was a normal key that limited the car to a sensible 235 miles per hour. The other was the top speed key. To unleash the full 253 miles per hour, you had to insert this special key into a slot next to the driver's seat. It was a whole ritual. This was not a technical necessity, it was theater. It was Bugatti's way of asking, "Are you sure you are qualified for this level of stupid?" It is the automotive equivalent of a waiver you have to sign before going on a roller coaster, except the waiver costs $2 million, and the roller coaster incinerates money instead of giving you a thrill. So after all the development, the homologation hoax, and the sales to confused billionaires, what was the final bill? Let us do the math that Volkswagen was too afraid to put on a spreadsheet. They spent roughly $1.5 billion to develop the car. They built 450 Veyrons across all variants. Even if you ignore the cost of actually building each car, which was millions, and just divide the development cost, that is over $3,300,000 in research and development sunk into every single chassis before they even bolted an engine in. When you factor in the materials, the hand-built labor at the French Chateau factory, and the fact that they sold most cars for around $1.5 million, the estimated real loss per car was well over $4 million. Let me say that again. For every Veyron they sold, the Volkswagen Group lost more than $4 million. They were literally paying people to take these masterpieces of engineering off their hands. It is the most expensive subscription service in history where the company pays the customer. So how does a public company hide a loss that massive? They bury it. Volkswagen, being a corporate behemoth that sold millions of sensible Golfs and Passats, simply absorbed the Veyron's losses into its overall financial structure. The project was a rounding error on their balance sheet, a tiny fiery crater hidden within the vast profitable landscape of the VW Group. They never broke out Bugatti's finances separately. It was the ultimate corporate magic trick. Make $1.5 billion disappear and hope the shareholders do not notice the smell of burning cash. This brings us to the opportunity cost, which is the real scandal. What could Volkswagen have done with that $1.5 billion? They could have fully developed 2 or 3 all-new mass-market electric vehicle platforms a decade ahead of schedule. They could have fixed the diesel emissions issue with actual engineering instead of cheating software, potentially saving themselves $34 billion in fines they later paid. They could have given every single one of their 200,000 employees a $7,500 bonus. Instead, they built 450 cars for people who already had a dozen other hypercars. The Veyron's legacy is one of staggering, monumental waste disguised as ambition. The ultimate irony, of course, is that the Veyron became a legend precisely because it was a financial failure. Its sheer, unapologetic disregard for cost is what made it iconic. It was a statement car in the purest sense, a statement that Volkswagen's chairman had a bigger ambition than anyone else in the industry. It succeeded in making history by failing spectacularly at business. It's the automotive version of that friend who becomes famous for setting a world record in the stupidest way possible. You don't admire their intelligence, you are just in awe of their commitment to the bit. So after losing a fortune on the Veyron, Volkswagen did the sensible thing. They did it again. The Chiron was their attempt to put a band-aid on a bullet wound. It was the corporate equivalent of saying that they had lost $4 million per car last time and asking how they could lose only $2 million this time. They made slight improvements in manufacturing, using more carbon fiber to save a few pounds. But the fundamentals were the same. An even more complex W16 engine, an even higher price tag, and a business model that still involved setting piles of cash on fire, just maybe with slightly less gasoline. The cycle continues. They lose millions to sell dozens. The Chiron is not a successor. It is a tribute act to financial insanity. So what's the real legacy of the Veyron? It became the benchmark for automotive insanity, a line in the sand that no other sane manufacturer has ever tried to cross. Companies like Koenigsegg and Hennessy looked at the Veyron's financials and said, yes, we'll make fast cars, but we're not that stupid. It proved that the ultimate luxury is not leather or gold. It is wasting money on a scale so grand it becomes art. The Veyron is the automotive version of a Faberge egg, priceless, useless, and a monument to the fact that someone had way too much money and a seriously unhinged idea. The Veyron is the ultimate monument to one man's ego winning a war against basic math. It's a beautiful, glorious failure. Want to see which brand we roast for burning cash next? Vote in the comments. Subscribe for more tales of automotive fiscal insanity.